Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we have got a couple more beers that we've gotten from Tavour, and we are doing two different brewers, but same style. So first, we've got 903 Brewers Welcome to Canada. This is a maple coffee Imperial Stout, clocking in at 11.3% ABV. 903 Brewers is based out of Sherman, Texas. Number two is beer from Second Shift Brewing. This is the first beer I've ever had by them. This one's called Liquid Spiritual Delight, and it's a vanilla coffee flavored Imperial Stout. This one clocks in slightly higher at 11.5% ABV, and Second Shift is based out of St. Louis, Missouri. So we've got two different flavored Imperial Stouts that are coffee Imperial Stouts. One with maple, one with vanilla. Ridiculously similar ABVs, so this is going to be a very fun kind of trip down some flavored coffee Imperial Stouts. Absolutely love them. One of my favorite styles. I love Imperial Stouts in general. I love flavored Imperial Stouts, and I love coffee stouts and Imperial Stouts. So you get coffee and some additional flavors in an Imperial package. I think we're going to be in for a treat. So we're going to dive right in and see what these are about. Starting with 903 Brewers, Welcome to Canada, the Maple Coffee Imperial Stout, clocking in at 11.3% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with the first beer of today's flavored coffee Imperial Stout review, we have got 903 Brewers Welcome to Canada. This one's a Maple Coffee Imperial Stout, clocking in at 11.3% ABV. 903 Brewers is based in Sherman, Texas. So first things first, they've always got some really interesting and fun artwork. This one's no different. It's got kind of a Canada-themed scene here. Maybe some people caravanning and driving down the road, and it's got a sign for the Maple Coffee Stout. So, you know, it is what it is. Looks neat. I like it. It's very, get you in the mood, set the scene. Let's get this one cracked gently. Okay, nice. It's been really quite a while since one's gotten away from me in a can, but let's get this poured. 11.3, we'll see how it looks. Oh, very dark indeed. Now pouring this, it actually doesn't look as thick as I anticipated, and I can see a decent bit of carbonation, so we're going to give this a little quicker agitation, give it a chance to form a head. All right, yep, that's not bad at all. I think we pretty much got that all in there. Visually, as you might expect from an Imperial Stout, it is pitch black, and I can tell you, it's got a pungent aroma. I can smell it from here. And the closer you get to it, the more intense it gets. I gotta tell you just how absolutely incredible this beer smells. It reeks of coffee and maple, and it smells like they are just perfectly balanced. I'm getting 50-50 maple and coffee, and it just smells like heaven in a glass. And head has already dissipated a little bit, but it's holding okay. It's got decent retention and cling to the sides. Got a little pad floating on top. So let's just jump right in. Give this a sip. Oh, absolutely, yes. Oh, that's a huge beer. That's a huge beer. Okay. So, for starters, my first initial impression is that flavor-wise, the coffee is quite pungent. It's very, very pungent. It comes through quite strongly. I would say overall the coffee is more present in the flavor than the maple, but the maple is not drowned out by any stretch of the imagination. It's just coffee dominant with the maple behind, which honestly, in a beer, and particularly in an Imperial Stout, where you still want to have a nice roasty edge to the malt that's accentuated into this big, heavy stout, I think that's the way to do it. And coffee really helps accentuate and play on those natural malt traits and flavor characteristics anyway. And then the maple's just added in as this extra treat. This is not a sweet stout. It's not brewed with lactose, so it's not a milk stout. So you're just getting pure flavor. Now, that said, the maple aroma and addition and flavor in the beer does kind of psychologically make you think sweet, even though there's not a hint of sweetness at all in this beer. It's not by any stretch. I wouldn't call it bitter either. It's just a normal standard Imperial Stout. It's got the same kind of what you expect from that bill, just with some huge and delicious flavor added. So I'm going to jump in for another sip for body and mouthfeel, start to explore how the flavors develop. Body is medium heavy, maybe a little bit lighter than I anticipated, but not by much. It's still got good presence. Mouthfeel, it's got a nice thickness to it. I wouldn't call it viscous. It's not syrupy, but it's definitely got some resistance as you move it around the palate. So there's some thickness there. And further, if you do start to agitate it around the palate, it does get ridiculously creamy. Ridiculously creamy. And further, kind of adding and playing into the actual thickness of the mouthfeel. It's very, very nice. This beer feels like it has substance in your mouth, and 11.3%, that's a nice way to do it. The way the flavors develop, honestly, there's so much I'm thinking about at once, I got to jump in for one more sip. But I do like the balance, my gut reaction. First get it in your mouth and swish it around and swallow. Immediately, you get a burst of maple up front, followed by coffee. Then the coffee kind of overtakes the maple, and then it kind of settles down, and they're almost at an even keel. Then that kind of holds steady, though at quite an intense level, for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then it slowly starts to tail off in intensity from the coffee while the maple's still holding. Then they kind of meet this equilibrium state, and they hold there for a few seconds, and then the flavor continues to descend where the maple gets out of the way a little more and the coffee rides on top. It is absolutely delicious. While I can't say it's an even 50-50 balance at all, the balance that they did put in this beer, I think is exactly right for the flavors they chose and the intensity of it. I personally wouldn't change a thing. I think they nailed it with the balance of the coffee and the maple in tandem with their chosen malt bill. It is just absolutely superb. I love this beer. I'm going to take my sweet time sipping on this, enjoying every last drop while I come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to our second beer. This is Second Shift Brewing's Liquid Spiritual Delight. This is the vanilla coffee version, also an Imperial Stout at 11.5% ABV. Okay, now moving on to the second beer of today's flavored Imperial, basically flavored coffee Imperial Stout review. We've got Second Shift Brewing's Liquid Spiritual Delight. This is their vanilla coffee version. They have different flavors of this same beer. So this is the vanilla coffee, 11.5% ABV on this one, so slightly higher than the 903 Brewers offering. Second Shift is based out of St. Louis, Missouri. So for starters, first beer by this brewer I've ever had, so I'm definitely excited about that. In terms of label art, they've actually got, it might be kind of hard for the camera to pick it up, they've actually got some pretty interesting label art on here. At the top it says artwork by Kyle Scarborough from the Washington Tattoo Collective. So they've got some pretty neat stuff they've got going on, but that's about the extent. Let's get this one cracked. Gently. All right, not bad. So far, so good. And, okay, I got a little on my hand, but that's okay. Just poured right into the glass. Seems pretty thick as that's pouring out. That does seem quite thick. It's hard to tell the carbonation, but it looks like it's forming a pretty good head. Yeah, that looks nice. All right, I think I more or less got that out. All right. Visually, this is absolutely pitch black. Not a hint of light is coming through this beer, so that is a textbook Imperial Stout appearance. Really looks great. And that head really did form quite well, and it looks quite lush and creamy. It's holding quite well, too. Let's give this a sniff. So in terms of aroma pungency, it's not the most pungent in the world, but once you get up on it, it smells quite nice. You can smell the malt, and you can smell the coffee, and you can smell the vanilla. So you definitely get everything that is built into this beer in the aroma does come through, albeit not ridiculously pungent. it does come through when you get right up near the glass, and it smells quite nice. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Oh, that's a big beer. Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, I know it's 11 and a half, but the smell didn't come through that pungent. Once you got it in your mouth, you could taste it, but it's once you swallow, bam, it comes in full force. Got this really nice boozy kick up front. Really nice boozy kick, and it's one that does have a nice bit of a warming sensation. Now, I can tell you, in terms of the balance of the coffee and the vanilla and the malt bill, I'm getting a good bit of the malt bill. The coffee is actually rather subtle in this one. The vanilla does come through quite strongly though, and even though it's not a milk stout, it does add the impression, kind of psychologically where your brain goes, of sweetness, just due to the vanilla being in there. It's quite nice. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel and start to explore these flavors. The body on this one is on the low end of medium heavy. It's not as robust as I anticipated, but it's not weak. At 11.5%, I expected it to be bigger, but it's still got a really nice body. Mouthfeel on this one, it does most definitely have a good bit of viscosity. This is a big beer, and it feels quite thick as it rolls around the palate. As you agitate it, it does get creamy, but not maybe as creamy as you would expect for an average stout. But it does add an extra added layer of thickness to the mouthfeel, so it's quite nice there. And in terms of the way the flavor develops, it doesn't get ridiculously intense. Honestly, at virtually any point along the flavor ride, other than when you first get it in your mouth and you swallow and you get that big boozy kick up front. That's the most intense of it, and really that doesn't even carry that much coffee or malt or vanilla flavor. That all happens after the initial kind of booze kick gets out of the way in the warming. So it's overall, I'd say intensity of flavor is pretty subdued. I don't want to say settled, I just say it's subdued, especially for what you may anticipate in an 11.5% ABV beer. I'm going to jump back in for one more sip here. Big boozy kick and a boatload of vanilla immediately behind it. Kind of pairs up front, then the booze overtakes it, then the vanilla comes through. That holds for a few seconds, then slowly, very slowly, the coffee comes in very much in the background. It is very background in this beer. Kind of the same thing with the malt bill. And the flavor intensity is a big peak up top, but it never just like sustains. It's just a big peak and then it starts to just tail off. In terms of the length of the finish, it's not particularly long. It's not as long as you would anticipate, certainly for the style and most definitely for the ABV. It does die off much quicker than your average flavored Imperial Stout, but what you do get tastes nice. Overall, I think the balance could use tweaking just for my own personal preference. I would have more coffee in here and certainly dial back the vanilla. I think that would help the coffee come through in greater intensity and clarity. And the same thing with the malt bill. They've got this nice, thick, roasty Imperial Stout malt base. Just back off a little bit on the vanilla and let the other flavors in the beer speak. But it is enjoyable. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now we're going to get both beers ranked, starting with the 903 Brewers. Welcome to Canada. This is the Maple Coffee Imperial Stout, clocking in at 11.3% ABV, and they are based out of Sherman, Texas. So starting with the aroma, this was one of those classic beers where you could smell from a great distance away, and it was positively pungent. You could get equal parts coffee and maple. I absolutely loved it. I knew I was in for a treat before I even jumped in. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste was exactly what I expected from the aroma. No question about it. It was a huge beer. Massively, massively big beer with equal parts maple and coffee. So what you smelled on the aroma came through in the flavor profile, and you still got a beautiful, rich malt backbone. Just fantastic beer. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the body was big, make no mistake, though it was not quite as robust as I anticipated for the style and the ABV range. Still well above average, it gets an 8 out of 10. For the finish was very, very long on this beer. Each sip went quite a long time. Maybe not quite as long as I expected for how big of a beer it was, how flavorful, and how big of a style and high of the ABV, but each sip really did go a very long time, and you kept getting to enjoy all of that maple and coffee interplay all the way to the end. I only docked 1 point, it gets a 9 out of 10. For the head and retention, this beer actually formed a pretty good head. No question about it. It was above average for a stout poured at home. Thicker beers, and it was pretty carbonated, so it's hard, without a nitro tap to really get a nice thick lush head, but it certainly was above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the appearance was textbook. Pitch black, could not see light through it. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was just exceptional. The balance between the malt bill and the additive ingredients, the maple and the coffee, was just absolute perfection. Maple is one of those ingredients that when added in beer can very quickly overpower everything else in the beer, other additives and the malt bill, and they nailed it, and it was absolutely delicious. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible, I love this beer. There's really nothing more to add. I think they absolutely nailed it. This is a home run. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of this style, there are many, many, many flavored Imperial Stouts out there, and Lord knows there are plenty of coffee and coffee Imperial and other flavor additive stouts out there, but I thought this was among the best that I've had to date. Well deserving. I give it a 10 out of 10. That brings the total score on 903 Brewers Welcome to Canada to a 92 out of 100. So no question about it, this is a top tier flavored Imperial Stout. Well worth seeking if you're a fan of the style. Moving on to beer number 2, Second Shift Brewing's Liquid Spiritual Delight. This is the Vanilla Coffee Imperial Stout, clocking in at 11.5% ABV, and they are based out of St. Louis, Missouri. So this was the first beer I've ever had from them. Sounded great, so I wanted to give it a shot. Starting with the aroma. Comparative, and not even comparing, this was super pungent compared to this one, just wasn't that pungent. Couldn't really detect much in terms of the aroma until you get right up on the glass. And even there, it didn't have super pungency. And really trying to detect the coffee and the vanilla balance was a bit of a challenge. I could get some, but not the other. It gets squarely average. It gets a 5 out of 10. For the taste, don't get me wrong, not a bad beer, but again, I was very much underwhelmed in terms of flavor. Just the sense of the pungency and the balance of what they put in just wasn't there for me. It tasted fine, but it didn't wow me. It lacked that it factor. Frankly, the vanilla overpowered the coffee, which I find really challenging to do in a beer, but it definitely drowned it out. And very much in an Imperial Stout that's got coffee, I want to let the coffee play into those deep roasty notes in the malt bill and to have the other flavors layer in and play into that. Just didn't happen. It gets average, it gets a 5. For the body, this beer actually had a nice body. Again, same as with the 903, it wasn't as large as I expected for the ABV range, but it was certainly well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. Mouthfeel. Mouthfeel on this one was quite nice. It really had quite a bit of viscosity to it and really felt appropriate for the ABV range and for the style. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish. Finish on this beer was another area where I was underwhelmed. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. Really, it fell squarely in the average range for me. Each sip really died down much quicker than I anticipated, and you didn't get to continue exploring the flavor elements, and they never really went into full force to kind of see if what you were getting up front was what the beer was actually about. It just died on the end of each sip before there was too much interplay. It gets average, it gets a 5 out of 10. Head and retention. Head and retention on this beer was great. It did actually quite a bit better than the 903. This one was not far off the mark from what I hope to get in a big Imperial Stout like this. Again, it's not on a nitro tap, but it did a great job. It formed well. It held very well. I only docked 1 point. It gets a 9. For the appearance, this was a textbook Imperial Stout, pitch black. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Balance. Balance on this one was one of the sticking categories for me. The vanilla was far too oppressive in comparison to the coffee, and really even to the fact that it drowned out the malt bill, which should be big and delicious and Imperial Stout. And I'm not saying it tasted bad, just the balance was off. The vanilla was way too heavy-handed. It needed more coffee to really marry and help bring the roasty edge of this beer up to the forefront. The vanilla just drowned it all out and did it a disservice in my opinion. I give it the low end of average, it gets a 4. Feeling in the intangible. I didn't hate the beer, but I was very, very underwhelmed overall. I had very high hopes and high expectations. It sounded amazing. It just kind of fell flat for me. In terms of the balance of the ingredients, how pungent they were, how long they lasted, I just didn't get enough out of it for a beer with these ingredients in it in this category. It just didn't do it for me. It gets the very low end of average. It gets a 3. Finally, is an example of the style. There are many, many, many flavored Imperial Stouts out there, coffee and other additives. And frankly, this one, it just fell short of being able to compete with even the most average out in the marketplace for me. As a concept, I like where they're going with it, but the execution, for my money, needs to be adjusted. It gets the low end of average, it gets a 4, which brings the total score on Second Shift Brewing's Liquid Spiritual Delight to a 63 out of 100. So we're looking at a very big disparity in points here, 29 specifically, and that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. This really just fell in the high end of average, and I think that's appropriately how I would categorize it. This is well above average by the points, and again, I think I would correctly categorize that as well. So, 2 different offerings, and these are just my opinions based on what I experienced. You may have a preference one way or the other. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.